Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please take your seats at this time as the program will begin momentarily.
Okay, thank you all for inviting me here. I'll start sharing my screen. Once I share my screen, I'm no longer able to see the chat. If you want to, please interrupt me with any questions you may have. I also communicated with Marcus that he will take note of the chat and interrupt me with any questions. Looking forward to hearing any thoughts and comments you may have. Let me select the slideshow. And if I'm not mistaken, you can see my screen right now. So thanks again for this kind invitation. Very nice to getting to know you virtually. Too bad we can't meet in person. I must say I was very impressed with the GatherTown environment, which also allows you, like on normal conferences, I didn't even know I missed it, to see who is talking to whom, something that we haven't been able to do over the last 2 years, and even eavesdrop on people. That's an interesting aspect that GatherTown can create for you. But today I'd like to talk about the self-regulation of desirable difficulties and the potential role of effort. Let me start with an example. So in one of the episodes of the sitcom The Simpsons, which you probably all know, Homer asks to Bart why he quit playing the guitar. You know, Dad, Bart then responds, I quit because I wasn't any good at it from the start. And then Homer replies, you know, no worries, my son. If something's hard to do, then it's not worth doing. So what do we have here? This is a classic example of self-regulation of learning, but it is a poor example because Bart decides he wants to learn something, he monitors his own learning, and then he decides to quit because he doesn't see any success as a result of his endeavors. And his dad even reinforces this approach. If something's hard to learn, then you better quit. This joke in The Simpsons is already about 30 years old, but it is actually a very common problem in education at all ages and at all levels. More than half of the learners do what Bart does and think what Homer thinks. Don't be fooled by the male appearance of the character on the slide I'm using here, because this poor self-regulation affects both male and female students. You may wonder whether this poor self-regulation is really such a big problem, because many of these students do finish school with a degree. And the answer is yes, because regulating your own behavior and your own learning is also crucial in the later workplace. And self-regulation ability is known to be a predictor of well-being and also overall life satisfaction. Now, since about 15 years, I studied the question of how we can aid learners to improve their self-regulation, their self-steering of learning, with the aim to improve their learning outcomes and to better prepare them for a later professional context in which adequate self-regulation we know is quintessential. During learning, be it reading a text, solving a problem, learning a new skill, continuous thoughts and feelings arise, also termed subjective experiences. And these subjective experiences often relate directly to learning, such as what is the next step that I have to take? I'll first do task 2, or A leads to B. But they also often indirectly relate to learning. And then they relate to learning in general, or the ability to acquire knowledge and skills, such as I can do this, or I've done this before. Both types of experiences affect learning. They can be strong determinants of learning when they influence further regulation of learning. They, for example, lead to the decision to study a text once more, but they can also lead learners to give up and quit. So unraveling these subjective experiences is a central part of aiming to improve self-regulation of learning. And I will advocate today that understanding and improving these subjective experiences, especially also of effort, are essential in accurate self-regulation of learning. When looking at the examples I just provided, it's clear that all learning takes place at 2 levels. On the one hand, a learner engages in the task itself, which is called the object level. On the other hand, there's the thinking about the learning task, which is termed the meta level. Between these 2 levels, 2 processes are constantly ongoing that form the essence of self-regulated learning. And for those of you who attended Martina Baers's keynote this morning, these will look very familiar. These two processes are represented in different theoretical models on self-regulated learning, because there are a number. Models that differ to a certain extent, but they all have this central assumption, actually, if you have a good look at them. So during learning, we constantly assess our own level of learning, also called monitoring. The subjective experiences mentioned before, they form part of this monitoring process, and they lead to what are called self-judgments, or as Martine phrased it, self-assessment of learning. This self-judgment reached at the meta level then determines control or regulation of learning, specifically the learning decisions the student will make to reread a text or to study another example problem, to choose a more difficult or an easier task, for example. Unfortunately, students have great difficulty accurately monitoring and regulating their learning. And they're often misled by what are their own subjective experiences while doing so. For example, if a text is interesting, or if it is easy to read, quick to read, they judge their learning to be easy and effective, which is typically not the case. Fortunately, there are interventions that can aid learners in improving their monitoring accuracy. Martina also mentioned some of these, and I will go into one of these right now. And these interventions can help students become better self-regulators. Research from one of our prior PhD students, Mariette van Loon, provides an example of this. Students here were asked to read a number of short texts, and these short texts contained causal relations, which are very typical for lots of texts that students in higher education read. One was, for example, about how Botox leads to less wrinkling in the skin. Now, typically, students had great trouble judging their learning of these texts. They were not very accurate in their estimations of their learning. Therefore, we provided them, prior to self-judging their learning, with an empty diagram that depicted the causal relations, how these were related, and we asked them to complete the empty boxes. What is actually the content of these boxes? This is what such a diagram looked like. And this is what the correct representation of the text information looked like. This is what they should have presented in the diagram. Now, when we looked at the effect of this diagramming instruction on monitoring accuracy, our findings showed that those who completed the diagram had improved their monitoring accuracy quite considerably over those who did not complete such a diagram. Since this first study, we've replicated this effect a number of times. And we also showed this effect when students themselves draw a diagram and complete it. Interestingly, the diagramming did not help them to judge the number of facts that they learned from the text, but it only affected their learning of the causal relations. And this was, of course, expected because the intervention focused on causal relations, but it was interesting to see that indeed it did not help them to improve factual learning, something that we also didn't want them to improve. We're taking this work on the instructional design of metacognitive interventions at the moment to a next level. Our postdoc, Hector Pijera Diaz, is working on automatically and immediately scoring the diagrams and providing learners with feedback on the cues they use to assess their learning. This automatic scoring then compares students' answers to a correct model answer and calculates whether the student boxes are correct or not. And it looks at, for each box, which model corresponds best. So in that way, these automatic scorings can help students to gain direct access to the quality of their self-judgments and thereby further improve their monitoring accuracy. But more on that in a different context when we have more data. So the question then is, why did this diagramming instruction improve monitoring accuracy? Let's go back to the beginning, where I described how subjective experiences of learning affect these self-judgments. What is important here is to what extent the content of the subjective experiences, or in other words, what we term the cues that these generate, to what extent these cues provide an accurate indication of the learning result, of the actual understanding, in this case, of the text that they had to read. So how diagnostic or predictive are these cues that students are using of their actual learning? Because that's what we want to further align, making sure that they use the cues that are the right predictors of their learning. Now, apparently, students who completed these diagrams were somehow less informed by, let's say, superficial cues like speed of reading, non-diagnostic cues such as interest, and more by what we term diagnostic cues, such as their actual ability to represent these causal relations. And a similar effect is known to occur when you have students provide keywords or a summary prior to judging their learning or any other type of generative instruction. Now, sometimes these diagnostic cues are indeed available, but students somehow are unable to use them when making these self-judgments. This happens, for instance, when a teacher provides feedback, but the student is unable to use it to improve their learning. So availability of diagnostic cues on one hand, and actual utilization of these cues is needed to come to more accurate monitoring. And the diagram instruction affected both positively. So the above makes clear that in order to improve self-judgments, that is, to have them match more closely with actual learning, our attention as researchers and teachers should focus on changing students' cue use during self-judgments. Instead of focusing on improving these self-judgments directly, we should concentrate on understanding and improving cue use in order to optimize this triangle between cues, judgments, and learning results. This makes the development of self-regulation in instructional design issue in which designing metacognitive interventions, then measuring actual cue use and optimal cue use are at its core. It's worth mentioning, though, that most of the research on metacognitive interventions from a cue utilization perspective have focused on improving self-monitoring and much less on improving self-regulation or the control aspect of learning. So an important next step in research is to not only improve monitoring of learning, but also regulation of learning. Even when students' monitoring increases, it is not self-evident that this carries over to their further regulation. For example, their decisions to restudy or to move on to a new task, to decide to study an easier or more difficult task, or deciding which learning strategy to apply. These regulation decisions turn out to carry with them aspects of cognitive load. Bjork and colleagues, in their review on self-regulated learning, already describe that applying self-regulated learning effectively raises many issues because learners generally have low knowledge of which SRL strategies are effective and which are not, because learners tend to assume that learning should feel easy. And if this is not a sign, and if this is not the case, then that is a sign that learning is actually low, and the task or the strategy is perhaps too difficult. And because learners also tend towards over-attributing differences they experience between learners to differences in innate ability that cannot be overcome. So that makes them less open to changing their learning strategies, as they experience the differences as unchangeable. This indicates that instructional design to improve self-regulated learning should explicitly address these knowledge limitations and erroneous beliefs. This is what we tackled in our learning strategy program, Study Smart, which is embedded in bachelor curricula of all faculties at Maastricht University. First, we explain to students which strategies are most effective to induce long-term learning and transfer. And we have them practice these strategies using their own learning materials. Then we address the myth that learning should always be easy. But we explain to them that instead this is known to feel effortful and to be effortful, especially when engaging in novel tasks and when studying new topics. Finally, we also go into how durable learning takes time and needs repetition, even on topics that are well known. We describe the positive effects of the Study Smart training in these references I mentioned on the screen. These issues are in fact self-monitoring and self-regulation issues. Students often think that once they have read an expository text, rereading it again will improve memory more than, for example, making a practice test about the text. But ample research, of course, shows the contrary. Making a practice text actually improves long-term learning better than rereading, also termed the well-known testing effect. As another example, students often prefer to study materials in the same order. But mixing or varying topics of study materials is actually typically a more conducive way to learn, which is called the interleaving effect. These examples show how learners prefer fluent or low effort learning, even though fluent learning typically does not enhance long-term memory and transfer. Instead, learners should be using long-term focus strategies that are indeed more effortful and that raise desirable difficulties, such as the mentioned retrieval practice and interleave practice. We're faced with a paradox here. How students experience learning differs from how they actually learn. The paradox arises because students avoid effortful learning, but also because desirable difficulties typically do not show immediate learning gains, but they only show delayed effects, for example, after several days. Students are actually misled by their own subjective experiences of effort and their experiences of learning that follow, and therefore they encounter difficulties to regulate their learning adequately. The problem of the role of experiences of effort in learning that mislead self-regulation was acknowledged within the early funded emerging field group monitoring and regulation of effort that was established in 2018. We're a research network of 29 junior and senior researchers from 12 different countries, all focused on understanding how students monitor and regulate learning efforts. Our approach is to develop a theoretical framework that integrates research and theory on self-regulated learning and on cognitive load. We're doing joint and multi-lab pilot research sponsored by the Jacobs Foundation with a specific focus on open science and sharing of data where possible and providing room for junior researchers to grow. I'm particularly proud of our special issue that was published exactly 1 year ago in Educational Psychology Review, and also how we were able to include all members of the EFG as co-authors in the editorial introduction that described our novel theoretical model. Because in essence, all science, of course, is team science. In fact, the team in team science is superfluous. Competition is an epiphenomenon of a lack of research resources typically, and in no way a means to optimize research quality. I look forward to the research endeavors we will further embark on with our EFG. And if you are interested, please have a look at our special issue that provides an review papers on this topic of monitoring regulation of effort in relation to self-regulation of learning. So in our current research and thinking about improving use of desirable difficulties, perceived effort plays an essential role in various ways. Effort is considered to be continuously monitored and experienced by learners. This is also termed passive load or data-driven perceptions of effort. That is, this is the effort that is experienced when working on a task and that is monitored at the meta level. On the other hand, effort is actively and dynamically managed or regulated. This is also referred to as active load or a goal-driven interpretation of effort. Although ratings of effort are traditionally considered as actually a valid indicator of actually expended resources, recent review research by Scheiter and colleagues describes how perceived effort can be biased, how it is often heuristic and therefore can actually be considered a type of metacognitive judgment that falls prey just the same to distortions in students' perceptions and experiences of learning. And just as metacognitive judgments, perceived effort can be biased by use of cues that are non-diagnostic of actual effort. Also, effort in itself can be used as a cue that informs judgments of learning or perceived learning. So if we visualize these proposed relations between effort, learning, and regulation of learning, this is what we see. In our line of thinking, we hypothesize that students' perceptions of effort influence and inform their perceptions of learning. And this typically happens in a negative way. So the higher the perceived effort, the lower their feeling of learning is. This then also affects the regulation of learning. For example, the decisions to use or not use a particularly effortful learning strategies or to choose a more difficult learning task. We also hypothesize that perceived effort can directly affect regulation of learning. When effort is very high or very low, and learners will either never or always opt for a specific learning strategy, regardless of the effect of effort on learning. In our research group, Felicitas Biva has examined how learners can be freed from this often erroneous belief of effort being negatively related to learning. Whereas Luotong Hui and Adam Onan have also incorporated how regulation of learning can be improved. Since these perceptions of learning and effort often stem from what we call the immediate learning experiences, we hypothesize that zooming out of the immediate learning experiences and providing students with insight into their subjective experiences across several learning moments, or that is across time, is a fruitful approach to improve the accuracy of perceived effort and learning, and thereby to optimize regulation of learning. Because over time, they will acknowledge that effort actually is not a strong predictor of learning, and that this higher effortful learning strategy actually is conducive to their learning. So to go into a bit more depth of some of our studies right now, Felicitas Biva's research has looked at the effect of our Study Smart program that I mentioned before, and the effect it has on students' use of effortful but desirable difficulties in their learning. Now, starting to the absolute left of the figure I present here, we saw that Study Smart actually improved students' metacognitive knowledge, just as we hoped, about what are effective learning strategies, and it also made them aware of gaps between their own strategy use and the scientific evidence of what should be used by them. Even though this then often increased their intention to change their strategy use, students ran into internal factors, external factors, and felt uncertain about different things when attempting to implement learning strategy change. This strongly underlines that real-life learning strategy change requires explicit support to students in addressing these factors and uncertainty, and that it is actually a clear example of behavior change. We are looking more into social psychological literature on behavioral change to help learners change their strategy use. It takes time and repetition in order to lead to sustainable learning behavior changes. Now, on a different study, Luotong Hui, who received her PhD only last week, she investigated, among others, how perceptions of effort, and specifically learning task-based perceptions of efforts, are mediated by perceived learning, just as in the triangular model I presented before, and how these are also related to the decision to use the more effortful but also more effective learning strategy, in this case, retrieval practice, or actively retrieving study materials from memory, instead of just passively resetting them. In higher education students who studied anatomical image name pairs, she found that the high task-based perceived effort that accompany these retrieval practice strategies directly related to a reduced retrieval practice choice. So there was no mediation in this case of perceived learning, but a direct effect from effort to strategy choice. But this mediation was found only when students received feedback on their learning, and they realized that there was a positive relation between effort and learning, in the sense that they were indeed choosing retrieval practice more, even though they experienced it to be more effortful. In another experimental study, Adam Onan examined how learners decide to use interleaved or block practice when they're doing a category learning task. Students studied painting styles of different artists, and they had to learn to recognize which painting belonged to which artist. He revealed how students' perceptions of effort and learning changed over time across multiple learning tasks. As we hypothesized, students' ratings of effort for interleaved practice decreased over time, whereas ratings for block practice actually increased over time. As for perceived learning, the reverse was found. Students indicated that over time, they were learning more from interleaved practice, whereas perceived learning of block practice, again, remained the same. So it's also clear from these graphs that at the end of the experiment, it was still the case that most students preferred block practice over interleaved practice, but it was also clear that for students to take the time to engage with interleaved practice more often, that was a productive way to help them see the advantages of interleaved practice on their learning and on the decrease of their mental effort. So what happened to their learning strategy choices across time? Interestingly, these changes in their on-task experiences also affected their regulation decisions. Across these different study units, they were asked 3 times to decide which learning strategy they wanted to use, either interleaved or block practice. And the percentage of students that chose the preferred more effective strategy, in this case, interleaved practice, increased significantly. So these studies provide proof that students' subjective perceptions of effort play a direct and sometimes also indirect role in self-regulation of learning, such as in this case, making learning strategy decisions. We're also doing qualitative research to understand how learners' prior beliefs and their learning habits and their task-based learning experiences together shape learners' perceptions of effort and learning during these situations. We explicitly incorporate these relations to perceived learning as I also already mentioned, propose a very intricate relation, possibly bidirectional even, between perceived effort and perceived learning. All in all, what I'm trying to say here is that incorporating these measures of effort is quintessential in self-regulation research. So this brings us to the issue of the need to teach and support learners to self-regulate their mental efforts as crucial to helping learners to self-regulate their use of desirable difficulties. This departs from the observation described previously that often students should learn how to regulate their effort on learning, because these initial perceptions of these subjective experiences might be misleading them and therefore might be inhibiting them to make the right learning decisions. An important question for further research thus is, how can students be supported to self-regulate their perceived effort on learning when effort is inevitably high, but when we also know that learning is most effective? It's all about helping learners to deal with these paradoxical relations between perceived learning and actual learning, and about helping learners embrace the high effort that comes with effective learning. What I propose is that dealing with this high effort that comes with desirable difficulties entails either accepting, reducing, or silencing the effort that is experienced. Accepting the effort in this case means embracing the higher efforts and, for instance, focusing on the positive effect it has on learning. This is also seen in what is called the IKEA effect, where learners are positive about putting in high effort, but because they like the result of the assembled furniture in their bedroom. Reducing the effort in this context refers to changing aspects of the learning context so that the high effort is experienced to a lesser extent. It all deals with increasing the experienced fluency of learning. Completely silencing the experienced effort is only possible in extreme circumstances and for short periods of time. For instance, when an important deadline is growing nearer. So attempting to change these perceptions of efforts in order to help students accept, reduce, or silence efforts can be done, in my view, at the learning strategy level, the task level, and the learner level. Starting with the strategy level, helping students accept effort means educating them about learning strategies, providing them with the right metacognitive knowledge, and also educating them of the importance of desirable difficulties. This is, for example, what is done in our Study Smart program. At a task level, it's actually all about having students experience the learning strategies and having them engage with the learning strategies, but also having them experience what desirable difficulties are and reflect on those. This is also done in our Study Smart program, but also in the research that I mentioned by Adam O, Nana Lo, and Tang Hui, where they had students experience these different strategies and then decide to choose which strategy to use. And that helped them to improve their strategy use. At the learner level, This is all about instructing students and explaining to them some motivation regulation strategies, such as imagining your future self or self-talk. These are promising strategies that can help students in general to deal with the high effort that they experience when engaging in desirable difficulties. When it comes to reducing effort, this is typically done at the task level or the learner level and not at the strategy level. It's all about increasing a sense of fluency in the learner. And one way to do that is by segmenting the task, so the learner is experiencing less effort and more fluency. But this is also something that students can do themselves, self-segmenting the task or taking regular breaks to manage their effort, or what athletes typically do, elite athletes typically do when engaging in exercise, teleo-anticipation, by exactly planning what you're going to do, how much effort it will cost, and when they need to take breaks. The silencing effort is actually only possible by the learner him or herself, and is only done when there is very high importance. For example, an upcoming deadline, or a student, as an example, a student cramming all night. Procrastination can also be a way to increase the importance, because then the time pressure is on. And that can help students to actually disregard their perceptions of effort and just continue. But as mentioned, this is, of course, something that we should further explore, and that should be used wisely and with caution by students in moderation. I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Today, I wanted to share with you how research on self-regulation of learning has unraveled the importance of diagnostic cue use and how instructional design can support this. I also mentioned that in self-regulation of learning, students have to deal with a paradoxical relation between experienced learning and actual learning. Understanding how to support learners is best done in collaborative international settings, since all science is team science. Important novel directions for research in the domain of self-regulation and in the domain of cognitive load are examining how perceived effort affects self-regulation of learning and how students can be helped to accept, reduce, or silence effort, since this is needed for an effective self-regulated learner in an information-dense world where learning decisions abound. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.